Um, Firstly, thanks, Helen, for inviting me to talk to you this evening. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you about a variety of topics connected with climate, COP, IPCC, and especially Wicklow, which of course is a very special county. And I say that because Wicklow and climate have a very long, tangled history. Many of you will know, I think, that Wicklow was the subject of very intense glaciation during the last glacial event. And I wanted to just tell you a little about that to begin with, because a major climate change event took place towards the end of that last glaciation. You know how much of Ireland was covered by ice, up to half a mile thick. Most of it was coming from the Midlands of Ireland, and you'll see the map on the top left there, and it spread towards Wicklow from the Midlands. But there was also an ice cap over the Wicklow Mountains themselves, and ice streamed out from quarries, quarries like Loch Bray Upper, Loch Bray Lower, quarries like the one at Turlough Hill, which is now, of course, a reservoir. And the two ice streams met and coalesced. Now, as the climate changed and as glaciation came to an end, those two ice streams pulled apart and they left a gap between them. And you can see on the map on the right here how there's a little ice cap still remaining over the highest of the Wicklow Mountains, and how the Midland ice here had retreated away. And what happened then was very interesting, because lots and lots of water began to pour out from both those ice caps and pour into that void between the two. And that void between the two filled up with huge amounts of meltwater, most of it from the Wicklow Mountain ice cap, and it formed a huge lake, a huge set of glacial lakes. And those glacial lakes, bigger than even today, the Blessington Reservoir, other ones at Glenasmole, and even round as far as Enniskerry. And I'm showing you this because there was a barrier to that water escaping. Those of you who know Wicklow will know that if you go west of Blessington, you hit a ridge, you hit an area of higher ground. And so the water from that huge glacial lake couldn't escape. And it built up into a very large body of water. And eventually, like anything, it overflowed. And it overflowed in many key areas around Wicklow, which some of you will be very familiar with. So if you travel, for example, into Hollywood Glen, you'll see the lovely V-shaped notch here at Hollywood Glen, where that lake overflowed and cut into the bedrock probably in about a few decades at most, and carved out a really deep trench into the bare rock there. There's another one at Tour. You can see it here, this overflow channel here. And of course, the best known one is at Poulaphouca itself to the south, where the meltwater poured out through the waterfall. And it was obviously very easy then for people in the 1930s to dam up that waterfall and create the Poulaphouca Dam. There's another very interesting little gorge. If you drive between Blessington and Naas, you go through a very narrow little valley, which again is cut into bare rock, where again you're looking at a former outfall from that huge glacial lake. So climate change, the period at the end of the Ice Age, was very instrumental in shaping Wicklow, in shaping the topography of Wicklow as well. And of course, there was another thing happening further west, where the main ice sheet was also pouring large amounts of sediment into that glacial lake, creating deltas. And deltas very similar to what we see today in New Orleans, even in places like the Nile Delta, where the rivers pouring meltwater came to a full stop when they hit the lake and dumped their sediment in these great layers, which for the past 50 years have now been mined at Blessington to produce the sand and gravel, which has largely built cities like Dublin over those many years. And as it pulled back even further, that ice created great outwash plains of sediment, which gives us the very unique landscape of the Curragh of Kildare today, the treeless landscape of sand, which was so good for training racehorses on, so good for military maneuvers on, because it drained so freely and never got waterlogged. It was sandy and pebbly. So climate fluctuations have always played a part in shaping the landscape. But now, of course, we're aware that there is another climate change underway, another big wave, if you like, of climate change, which is going to hit us. And already many parts of the world are showing a very marked warming up from what they were before we started putting things into the atmosphere about 150 years ago on a grand scale. I'm showing you this rather hackneyed old map here. You've probably seen the versions of it before, which shows the world warming up from the end of the 19th century. But I'm showing it to make a couple of points, which I'll come back to later on. And the first one is that, you know, we often talk about 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. But when you see a map like this, it's important to realize that that is a global average. And for places, that average is very inappropriate. So for the interiors of the continents, you can see how the warming is much greater over the interiors of Eurasia, of North America, even of South America. And you can see how it's much less over the ocean. So when we're talking about 2 degrees of global warming, we're talking about 3 or 4 degrees in many parts of the world, especially in the high latitudes and especially over the interiors of the continents. So let's bear that in mind and ask, well, what's causing it? And we now know, of course, that the principal driver of these changes is what we're doing to the atmosphere itself. This is a rather strange looking graph, and that strange looking graph is actually showing concentrations of carbon dioxide from the South Pole on the left all the way to the North Pole on the right over time. It starts down here in 1979, and you can see how it's working its way now through the years since 1979, and you can see how universally the concentration at all those points, all those black dots where we're measuring carbon dioxide, has changed and has increased very substantially indeed. And you can see how even as we get into the turn of the last millennium, we're beginning to move away from the 300s. We're beginning to threaten the 400s now and again. There's one interesting thing that you probably noticed already, and that is that the graph is much jumpier on the right-hand side than the left-hand side. And there's a very good reason for that. It's because the right-hand side, of course, is the Northern Hemisphere. And in the Northern Hemisphere, most of the stations are on land. Most of the Northern Hemisphere is land. And on land, plants grow, and plants and leaves especially have the ability to remove carbon dioxide by the process of photosynthesis when they're on their trees. And then during the winter time, when the leaves have fallen off, there's nothing to remove the CO2, so the concentrations go up. So you get a much more seasonal regime in the Northern Hemisphere, because in the Southern Hemisphere, it's much more stable because it's mostly ocean. You don't have much land in the Southern Hemisphere, so you don't get that kind of effect. But you can see how already we're up over 400 parts per million by 2016. It's now well over 415, in fact. But you might ask the question, is that new? Is it something that hasn't happened before? And so we tried pushing the record back. We can push it back firstly from a lot less stations to the 1960s, and then use things like bubbles in the ice sheets, tree ring cores, and push it back even further. And you can see how it settles down at about 300 parts per million. And it stops, it doesn't get anywhere near the present levels, even when we push it back hundreds of thousands of years into the distant past. So we've done something really dramatic to the atmosphere. We've increased the level of that greenhouse gas hugely to a scale which has not been experienced even when we push our records back 800,000 years. So we have transformed the atmosphere, and we know this from looking at little bubbles that have been trapped in the ice sheets. We know layers of ice can enable us to date those bubbles, and we can therefore measure by melting that layer of ice what the concentration in the atmosphere was at that time. And you can see it's quite clear that there are ups and downs with glacial events and interglacial events, but nothing on the scale of what we've done to the atmosphere in recent years. So we've changed the carbon dioxide loading. We can't actually see the gas. If we were to trap it in a balloon, this is what it would look like, a ton of it here. And everybody tonight that's listening, we are responsible for about one of those balloons every month of our life. We produce that much CO2 in Ireland. We produce about 12 tons every year as individuals. And we're not very good at it in terms of we're one of the worst in the world. We're one of the third worst, for example, in the EU. We have emissions that are about 50% above the EU average. If we could look at those balloons, if we could just look at one day and see how it piles up in the atmosphere, we'd have 160,000 of them piled up every single day of our life. And here you can see I just piled them up in the entrance to the Liffey, entrance to Dublin Bay. And that's the kind of thing that we're doing. We're not conscious, of course, of the fact that we can't see that gas. Therefore, we don't have it in our consciousness in the way we would with smoke or something more toxic that we could smell or that we could see. Where's it coming from? Well, you can see from this rather strange map, which distorts the area of the countries to correspond to their emissions. Two very clear points here. Firstly, most of it is coming from the developed countries of the Northern Hemisphere, the countries of Western Europe, of North America, of even the rapidly developing countries of China, India, Japan, of course, big industrialized countries, South Korea. But you can see how little is contributed to the problem by the global south, by the developing countries. They are the people who probably will bear the brunt of this problem, but are not contributing to it anything like the way we are in the developed world. And if you think this little island up here is irrelevant, well, we can add up our emissions and they come to about the total emissions of the 400 million poorest people on the planet. So we can't escape that responsibility, and I'll come back to it later on. Now, we've had some very interesting science this year because we had the very influential report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which only comes out maybe once every 6 or 7 years, and it's the gold standard, if you like, for climate science. And this year it has told us, first of all, that the warming that we've seen is something that's been unprecedented in more than 2 millennia. We haven't seen that rate of warming to the level we've reached since the time of Christ, really. And also, we've seen that the last century and a half or so have been the warmest multi-century period in more than 100 millennia, going back way back into those ice age events. More importantly, we've also got evidence from the IPCC that this isn't natural. This is human controlled. If we run our climate models, for example, with only natural forcing, with only natural things like solar, like volcanic activity, then we would expect the world to be getting cooler or even slightly cooler than it is. It's only when we put in the greenhouse gases to our models that we get an output which corresponds very closely to that warming trend that the thermometers tell us is happening. So, if you like, we now have irrefutable evidence that what we're seeing is human controlled. It's us that control climate for the first time in human history. And therefore, we can begin to see what will happen if we carry on with that kind of emission rate. We can begin to see where the world will warm up quickest, which continents will be most vulnerable. But also we can begin to see as well that it's not just temperature. We can begin to see where the rainfall changes that can be so crucial for humankind will probably be most intensely felt. And perhaps the most important point of that is that places that get too much rain, even places like Ireland, are going to get more, and places that don't get enough rain, especially in the Mediterranean zone, especially parts of sub-Saharan Africa, are going to get less. So these are the worrying things that have come out of the IPCC this year. And also the other aspect is that the signals for those changes will come in the form of increased frequencies of extreme events, increased frequencies of high temperatures over land, for example, so that the once in a 10-year event that occurred in the past will become the once in a 2-year event if we warm by 2 degrees. And those kind of events will therefore become more intense. And that will occur for the very intense events as well, and also for rainfall. The kind of event that we had only maybe once in 10 years will become maybe once in 5 years if we get to 2 degrees of warming. And similarly for droughts. So we're facing the signal of climate change coming through extreme events. Now, when you look at those maps that I showed you and ask the question, can we avoid those warming trends? The prognosis is not that good. The IPCC say that no matter what we do, unfortunately, we're going to warm by 1.5 degrees in the next 20 years. We're going to warm by 2 degrees for 3 of their 5 scenarios in the next 20 years. Now, that's not an excuse for us not to tackle the problem. We can't throw our hands up and say, oh, we're goners, because there's a big difference between what kind of impacts we will feel at 1.5 and 2 degrees, for example. And so it's imperative that we try and do our best to avoid them. Why am I talking about 1.5 and 2 degrees anyway? Well, they're sometimes referred to as the Paris range because they are the values that were decided on at the Paris Conference of the Parties in 2015. And they were decided on as crucially important because the evidence began to mount that we're seeing things that we may lose when we hit those temperature values. The coral reefs will be gone if we're going to exceed 2 degrees. That's a sad reality. So if you want to see the Great Barrier Reef, go now, because your grandchildren will probably never see the coral reefs of the Great Barrier Reef. The alpine glaciers will probably start irrevocably disappearing around that range, as will the Arctic summer sea ice, and we know that's underway. We know also that Greenland is underway as well in terms of its melt out. It'll take a long time for Greenland to melt out, but these are what we call tipping points that it may not be possible even if we get our act together to recover from. And of course, there are a whole other range of rather nasty things waiting in the wings if we go to higher levels of warming as well. Now, there's a few areas that are really susceptible, really vulnerable, and you probably can guess those. First of all, the semi-arid regions, especially of sub-Saharan Africa, where people exist on just the minimum amount of rainfall to keep their cattle alive, to keep their crops growing. And if those rains fail, we know how quickly the fabric of those societies can collapse. We know the conflicts that will quickly emerge in that situation because we've seen some of them over recent decades already. And if you were to look at where those conflict zones are, they're around the edge of the equatorial zone. And just if you think of where the trouble is today, all of those zones of the Sahel, Ethiopia, the Sudan, parts of Uganda, Malawi, these are zones where there is already trouble. And you know, the resource balance is at the root in many of those issues. So while Asia has been drawing itself out of poverty, Africa has not. So these are going to be areas of acute concern where in fact the climate may not even enable the population to subsist on the kind of food they're used to. Second zone of interest is the zone of the low-lying states of the Indian Ocean and of the Pacific Ocean. Many of these countries lie maybe 2 or 3 meters above sea level. And for them, the prognosis is really bleak because they will be wiped out with a 3 or 4 meter rise in sea level. Maybe not in the next decade, but their groundwater will be infiltrated. They will lose their viability in many cases, even by the middle of this century. And those small island developing states have been very vociferous at the COP's meetings, pointing the finger at us in the developed world as the culprits who are effectively removing many of them from, or going to remove many of them from the face of the earth in terms of their homelands. If you take the small island developing states, like the Maldives, Kiribati, Tuvalu, almost all of those areas lie below 5 meters above sea level. So they have a very bleak prognosis for the future. And we have to ask questions of ourselves in terms of our moral right, of our perhaps conscientious responsibility here to acquiesce in their removal and their destruction. And I mention this because at the COP's meeting, that these cases were put very forcefully indeed by the residents of these small island developing states. This lady from the Marshall Islands asked the question, will I have a home in 30 years? Will my culture be gone? Will my homeland be lost forever? And the answer was probably going to be yes. She is going to be on the front line, the victim of climate change. The climate minister here from Tuvalu, you can see he's holding up his phone with his 3 grandchildren, and he's asking the world's assembled countries at COPs, what am I supposed to do? I haven't caused this problem. Why are you not taking it more seriously? And he was very emotive and very forceful, as those small island states always are at the COP. Here's his foreign minister here, sending a pre-recorded message. And if you pull back a little from that camera, well, he was making a very clear point that these islands are effectively sinking. So these are the issues that we have to tackle. That's the second vulnerable area. The third one is the delta regions of the world. Here's the Nile Delta. Cairo's down here somewhere, but here is the area where the Nile brings its sediment to the sea and then stops and dumps the sediment, giving, of course, the great alluvial riches on which civilization itself was founded. But such is the weight of those sediments that the land subsides, and it's going down now. It's subsiding as the sea level rises around it. So it's telescoping things into a much shorter time period. It's very clearly exemplified here in Bangladesh. You can see how much of that country lies 3, 4, 5 meters above sea level, especially the southern half here. It's about twice the size of Ireland. The difference really is that we've got 6 million people or so on this island. In that country, well, there's 160 million people. So what happens when this land is lost? What happens when a quarter of their land, even with a 1 meter rise in sea level, which we expect to see by the end of this century, goes? It makes questions, I think, of us as to how we're going to cope with refugees, how we're going to cope with displaced people. We've seen the tragic consequences even tonight of refugees being drowned in the English Channel. But what happens when you get millions and millions of displaced people from other parts of the world looking for somewhere to stay? It's going to cause, again, friction and difficulties. And again, these people have not caused the problem. We are the cause of the problem. We have to accept, I think, our responsibility. But even here in the developed world, we're beginning to see our own consequences coming home to roost a little. We know that we've seen the fires in Australia, we've seen the fires in California, we've seen the fires in Greece this summer. And we also know that we're burning a lot of tropical forests down as well, adding to the problem. And really, although we had a deforestation agreement at COP26, nobody holds out much hope for it, quite honestly, especially in places like Brazil, which the good that we did to stop and protect forests 10 years ago, all of that's now unraveling under President Bolsonaro's and under his policies. So we have issues here, and of course, nearer home, we saw even 3 months ago, we've probably forgotten now, but we saw the way in which the fires in Greece began to approach even Athens. We see the scar here around the island of Evia, burned out effectively by fires as recently as August. So these are things which tell us that the world is changing. It's changing in terms of temperature. We had the warmest year on record in Europe last year, the joint warmest year in the world as a whole. And we're seeing these things develop before our eyes. I wanted to say a little about some of the progress that we've made, though, in understanding a lot of this, because climate science has advanced quite strongly in the past couple of years. And I want to just briefly touch on 3 things. Helen mentioned that, you know, I did a lot of media work, and one of the questions I was always asked by the media after an extreme event, be it a flood, be it a heat wave, was this caused by climate change? And for the best part of 30 years, I had to say, no, I can't answer that because that event has happened in the past. All I can say is that it's more likely to have happened as a result of what we've done to the atmosphere. And that's a very woolly answer if you think about it. And I'm really pleased that now I can say with much more certainty, this event was caused by climate change. And that's come about because of an advance in our computing capabilities primarily, where instead of running a climate model once, we can run it hundreds of times now, and we can run it 100 times or 500 times with pre-industrial levels of carbon dioxide, and then run it 500 times with current levels of carbon dioxide, and ask the question, how much more likely is a heat wave in France like this going to occur? And we can look at the probability, and it comes up really alarming that in this case in 2019, where temperatures hit nearly 46 degrees centigrade in France, then it was rendered 10 times more likely as a consequence of climate change. And even last year, we had this amazing heat wave in Siberia, where right up, not too far from the pole, in a place where the January temperatures and even the temperatures around about today, the average is about minus 40 degrees centigrade in November and December. It doesn't get very much warmer than Ireland, even in the summer, but it had 38 degrees centigrade of a temperature. And again, using the same kind of theory, you know, we see that it's now something like 600 times more likely to have occurred as a consequence of climate change. And you may remember the German floods, those tragic floods which occurred this summer, they were 9 times more likely to have occurred as a consequence. So we can do quantitative analysis now, and we can be more definitive about what's happening. The second, and I won't dwell on this one because it's a bit complicated, but the second major advance has come in tweaking our climate models. One of the things you have to tell a climate model is, what gear do you want to operate in? And the gear is, well, what if we doubled CO2 would be the temperature increase? And for 30 years, that was uncertain. It was somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5. All the way back to the 1990s. And that uncertainty meant that we couldn't be definitive about climate modeling in the way that we can today, because the 6th assessment report has narrowed that range considerably. So we now know it's somewhere not 1.5 to 4.5, but 2.5 to 4. And that means our models are going to be much more confident. But more importantly, it's the death knell for some of the skeptics. And the skeptics' last, if you like, redoubt was to say, oh, the sensitivity of the Earth is maybe only 1.5 or even 1 degree to the warming, to the doubling of CO2. And you can see, you know, some of the skeptics here, some of the papers were quoted ad nauseum as justification for skeptics. That now I think is gone as well. And the last thing I wanted to mention here was that we now are much more conscious of the role of the Arctic sea summer ice, which has been dwindling, as we know. Every summer it's been getting less and less, so that even today not today, but even when it reached its minimum this autumn, you could have sailed from Wicklow town, for example, all the way around the north coast to China, to Japan, without seeing any ice. You could also, with a bit more difficulty this summer, have gone through the Northwest Passage. It looked like the summer sea ice was going to reach a very record minimum low this summer, but it kind of rallied a bit. It's now well short of its average, but it's not quite as disastrous as people thought it was going to be for this 1 year. But that ice is quite thin. It means that, of course, that it has opened up the sea routes around Siberia, around northern Russia. About 400 voyages took place in 2020. A very fragile environment, if you think about it. You don't want an oil spill up in these parts of the world if you can avoid it. But of course, it's much cheaper than going around the Cape of Good Hope or even the Suez Canal to get to the Far East that way as well. But why is that important? Well, it's important because what we now know is that the summer sea ice has an influence on the jet stream, and the jet stream wobbles a lot more if there's less in the way of summer sea ice. If the Arctic is warmer than usual, we get these kind of wobbles in the jet stream, and that means that you get more extremes, you get more anomalous weather. And a good example of that, maybe you remember the very cold winter we had in 2018. It was a really warm winter over North America, over Greenland. It was extremely warm. And then the jet stream plunged away south of us to give us a cold winter then. And then quite the opposite in 2019. It was a really cold winter over North America. The jet stream was plunging south, and it went away north over us, giving us a mild winter where the daffodils were out in January and so on. So these things we now realize are connected. Now, all of this has consequences for Ireland. If you travel up into Liffey Head Bog, for example, you'll know that the bogs depend on saturation. So a summer dryness is not going to be very beneficial for retaining the rich flora and fauna of our boglands. It's not going to be beneficial, the sea level rise, for our salt marshes, even for the Machair coastlines and vegetation of Connemara, and for the Wicklows. You know, we know that as it gets warmer, some of the species that you're so familiar with in the Wicklow Mountains, maybe they can go uphill a little to the colder regime that will exist there. But what happens when they get to the top? Then they become extinct. So montane habitats like the Wicklows are going to be victims. And of course, species that depend on temperature are going to be victims as well. And I wanted particularly to mention here the Arctic char, because if you go up to Loch Bray, if you go up to Loch Nahannigan, if you go up to Loch Tay, those high-level lakes will have Arctic char in them, which are a really cold-loving species of fish, quite rare, but they're not going to like it when those waters warm up. Even salmon are not going to like it when the waters warm up. And of course, we know that some species are already suffering losses of habitat, partly related to climate change, like the curlew, which is a kind of enigmatic species. There's only 160 breeding pairs left in Ireland, despite how many people in Ireland grew up on the bog listening to them. So Ireland has not, therefore, it's not a country that will avoid the worst problems of climate change, but it's not a country which has been really demonstrating a capability of tackling it. Whereas most of Europe have shown consistent declines in their greenhouse gas emissions, Ireland has, after a bit of a decline, begun to go into reverse here and begin to flatline and even increase, to the point that we're now the third highest in the EU in terms of our per capita emissions of greenhouse gases. And this league table for the rest of the world has placed us away down somewhere around 46th place in the world. Not quite in the relegation zone, not quite in the Saudi Arabias or in the Australia categories, but really not up there with countries that we would expect on the basis of our GDP to be doing a much better job on. So we've been failing to follow our commitments, which we signed up to in 2008, to reduce our emissions by 20%. We've been flatlining. We have not met those emissions, and now we're in the stage of trying to undo some of that damage. Partly the reason, of course, is that we have very high emissions from agriculture. We're out on our own in terms of the percentage of our emissions that come from agriculture, and that would account for about 35% of our total emissions. It's much higher than any other country in the EU. And it's mainly livestock agriculture. Livestock in the globe accounts for about 14% of total greenhouse gas emissions. And if you were to take the major industrialized countries and look at the carbon footprint of some of those big food companies, you find that they would exceed the total emissions of countries like Germany, Canada, the UK, and so on. So these are very large scale operations indeed. And we've seen in Ireland how much we have increased our dairy herd in recent years as the milk quota was reduced. And that has also been accompanied by an intensification of agriculture, whereby even for an individual cow, the methane emissions per cow have increased because of the extra feedstuffs that we're cramming into our cattle. So we've seen that really stalling the progress that we were making up until, say, 2011, 2012 in reducing our emissions. And we've seen some counties with very large numbers indeed of dairy cows. There are 300,000 plus in Cork alone. Wicklow is not a dairying county, of course, so there's not that many dairy cows in Wicklow. But if you look at that map of cow numbers and then look at the areas where there's problems with nitrates, where there's problems with water quality, you can see that they correspond very closely indeed, as has been confirmed by the EPA, for example. When I was playing with this presentation in the afternoon, I thought to myself, well, Wicklow is by far the county with most forest cover in Ireland. Is Wicklow, for example, a carbon neutral county or not? So I started doing a few sums on that. There's about 44,000 hectares of forest in Wicklow. About 22% of the county is forested. And if you add up, what Sitka spruce, for example, which is what most of the forests in Wicklow are, how much carbon do they take out of the atmosphere? You get about 6-7 tons per hectare per year. That would amount to about 300,000 tons per year taken out of the atmosphere. Now, it's a gross figure because, of course, a lot of the forests are cut down then every year. Some of them are burned. So we can't actually say all of this is good because forests really have to stay for a long, long time to justify them as sequestering. But if you were to take the population of Wicklow, about 150,000 people, and proportionally ask, well, how much do Wicklow people emit of the national total? Well, you get a population equivalent mix of about 2 million tons per annum. What I'm trying to say here is that even in the most densely forested part of Ireland, we can never really get to carbon neutrality without really dramatic reductions in our emissions total. And in fact, for Ireland as a whole, our land use is a source of about 4 million tons per annum, mostly from grasslands and from drained soil. So a long way to go to get the problem tackled. And of course, we know now as well that we're tackling that in a legal context with a carbon budget-based system where a national carbon budget is established, and then that's divvied up by sector by the minister, and that will happen in the next 3 or 4 months, and that's really going to be quite a contentious issue. You might say, well, okay, we have a carbon budget, we have to get to 51% below where we were in 2018 by 2030. It's not going to be a linear one. It's going to be one where, of course, political pressures will say, let's do the heavy lifting a bit later on. And that to some extent is happening, but it's not as dramatic as I feared. But this is what we have as a national carbon budget now, 295 million tonnes. Remember, we were emitting about 60 per year last year. So you can see where we have to chop back quite considerably to get to that value. And that's going to be very contentious, especially with agriculture, because if one sector wins, another sector loses. So if, for example, agriculture was to only be allocated a 15% reduction, it would mean the rest of society has to manage 80%. If agriculture only gets 33%, the rest of society has to manage 60%. So this is where the jockeying for position will be going on at present. And of course, COP was also thinking of global carbon budgets as well. COP's main objective this year was to settle, finally, the rule book that would apply for the Paris Agreement of 2015. It's astonishing, if you think about it, that we didn't have a rule book established as to who measures, what do you measure, when do you measure it for each country in a standardized way. And that was the main objective of Paris. And to be honest, I'm not that confident that Paris will succeed at all, because the pledges, when you look at them from individual countries, they're often couched in such a way that wouldn't give you confidence that they really are going to mean business. And I've got three here very briefly to look at. First is Jordan, and Jordan are going to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 14%. That's their pledge. But if they don't get the money, if they don't get the aid, then they're going to be only 1.5%. So you can see an economic conditionality. Palestine, 24% reduction, great. But if the occupation of Palestine doesn't end, 12.8%, a political conditionality. Israel itself, they're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a per capita amount by 2030, 26% per capita amount. But of course, if you think of, well, what's the population doing in the meantime? If it's increasing hugely, then you're actually looking at an increase rather than a reduction, a statistical conditionality, if you like, there as well. So this doesn't give a great deal of confidence that despite the demonstrations, despite the outpouring of emotions during COP26, that things will be achieved. Now, there were some good things, and I'm going to go quickly through them because I'm nearly out of time. But, you know, countries are going to be forced to come back with more ambitious pledges with a new rule book next year. And that's the most positive thing, because it will force them to think more objectively about what they're delivering and what they're not delivering. There is an increase in the money that's going to be given to the developing countries, but it's still a long way short of what they actually need. This is not a big amount. You know, 100 billion you might think is a huge amount. We actually subsidize in Ireland fossil fuels to the extent of 2.4 billion euros each year. So it's not huge. There's a doubling of adaptation money, which is good. And there's a recognition of the IPCC, which is good as well, the actual figures in the IPCC report. But like everybody else, you probably saw the way in which at the end of the day, there was a watering down of some of these sentiments. So instead of, for example, the phasing out of coal, it now has become the phase down of unabated coal power, which can mean anything to anybody. Instead of the removal of fossil fuel subsidies, it's the phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Now, I don't know what an inefficient fossil fuel subsidy and what's an efficient one. So you can see that there are get out clauses, and equally there are get out clauses for methane. We've already heard the Taoiseach say it's a global figure that would apply to Ireland after signing the agreement. And of course, there will be concerns as well about the way in which developed countries are willing to make reparation of any kind for those extremes that are coming from climate change in the developing world. So many of the most positive things in a COP don't come from the floor. They come from side events, and they come from side agreements from more progressive countries. And I'm very pleased that Ireland was very progressive at this COP. and it signed up to what's called the Beyond the Oil and Gas Agreement. 11 countries or so have signed up to that now. You can see the minister here promising Ireland to do that as well. There was also an agreement of sorts between the US and China, which was largely based on the personal relationships, I think, between John Kerry and the Chinese negotiator Xi. But we have to wait and see what meat will be put in the bone of that. Now, the last couple of points here I wanted to mention were what's happening outside these formal agreements. And one thing which is really encouraging is that many people, many bodies, many institutions are now saying, we don't want to invest our pensions, we don't want to invest our money anymore in fossil fuel related funds. And I'm very pleased that the universities have been to the forefront of this. Maynooth was the first in Ireland to say that, and has taken its money out of fossil fuels. But foundations like the Rockefellers, foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates have been very active as well, and also the churches. And the Irish churches have been in the forefront of this. The Church of Ireland to begin with, and then the Catholic diocese are now almost completely divested. And also sovereign wealth funds. Now, sovereign wealth funds are where countries invest their money. And the first country to declare it wouldn't invest money in fossil fuels, I'm very pleased to say, was Ireland. So there's a lot of money moving away from the fossil fuel industry and moving into more sustainable sources. Lastly, before Helen shuts me up completely, I just wanted to ask the question, well, what is our fair share of what's left of the carbon budget? And you know, it certainly is not a 7% reduction per year. It's probably more like an 11% reduction per year, given our historic responsibilities. And unless we achieve that, we're actually going to be in debt, if you like, in carbon debt to the rest of the world within the next 3 or 4 years. And the people that have realized this, of course, you all know them, they are the young people of the world. They are the people who have now grasped the urgency of climate change because they realize it's an intergenerational issue. For them, it's what kind of legacy do they inherit from old geezers like myself and old timers who haven't really had the, I suppose, the wherewithal to solve this problem during our lifetime. Lastly, I wanted to finish on a nice note here because this is a glacier in Iceland in 1986. And this is what it looked like a couple of years ago. It's gone. And it was the first glacier to lose its status, to die, if you like, in Iceland as a glacier. So the Prime Minister decided, well, what do? You put up a headstone. So let's put up a headstone to this glacier. And she nailed on this plaque. And I'm going to finish on this because I think it says it all. So what does it say? It says, Uppnajökull here is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers will go the same way. And this monument is to acknowledge, and here are the 3 things to finish on. We know what's happening. We know the science. We know what needs to be done. We know what action we have to take. And finally, the message for the next generation, only you know if we did it. And that really epitomizes the problem that we have to pass on to the next generation. What kind of responsibilities are we going to stand up and be counted on? Thanks very much. I'll leave it to questions. I'm sorry I went on so long.